I did not expect the Kings to be this bad this quickly. I understand their issues, they simply can't score, but like any downfall, you have to have a rise to the top. In this video, like all my others, we'll go through the rise of the LA Kings and how they won 2 Stanley Cups in 2012 and 2014. But then I will look at their slow decline, which ultimately has them where they are today. And before the video starts, I really wanted to say that the Kings were probably one of the most interesting stories I've looked at in terms of how they were built. There are a lot of moving parts, different roster acquisitions, movement in the front office, and coaching staff. So I wanted to say I apologize if this video is all over the place, because these Kings were really built all over the place. So let's begin. Now, the Los Angeles Kings were added to the NHL in 1967 and became one of 6 new teams added to the original 6. Despite lack of playoff success and not winning a Stanley Cup, the Los Angeles Kings had a lot of great players in their history. Now, the Kings had only made 1 Stanley Cup, which was in 1993, but they lost to Montreal in 5 games. But after that lone Stanley Cup appearance in 1993, the Kings went through struggles on and off the ice. They had to trade many of their great players, including Wayne Gretzky in 1996. The Kings also left the Forum in 1999 to move to the Staples Center along with the Lakers. They saw some success early on there. They made the playoffs their first 3 seasons at the Staples Center, but they were never serious Cup contenders, and after 2002, the Kings didn't make the playoffs again until the 2010 playoffs. So they had to do some building for their roster, and let's dive into that. Back in 2003, the Kings drafted Dustin Brown the first round with pick number 13. Dustin would go on to be the captain of the Kings in both of their Stanley Cup championships. Then in 2005, the Kings drafted future MVP candidate and all-star center Anze Kopitar with the 11th pick in the first round. Also in that draft, they took their goalie of the future in Jonathan Quick in the 3rd round with pick number 72. In 2006, the Kings hired former general manager of the San Jose Sharks and Dean Lombardi to replace Dave Taylor. Dean took over the Kings team that had not made the playoffs in 3 seasons, and his mission was to rebuild the Kings roster. Now, Dean had his hits and misses when he was drafting players. He drafted Jonathan Bernier and Trevor Lewis in the first round in 2006. In 2007, Dean drafted Thomas Hickey 4th overall, who was a complete bust for the Kings. But he also drafted Wayne Simmons in the 2nd round and Alec Martinez and Dwight King in the 4th round. Then in 2008, the Kings drafted 2nd overall and got one of the best defensemen in the NHL currently in Drew Doughty, who would become one of their best blue chip players. Then in 2009, the Kings took Braden Shen with the 5th pick overall in the draft. Now, it's hard to mention everything in one video because building a team is very complex, and there's a lot of stuff that happens. But I will get into how these draft picks will be utilized for the Kings. Even though some of these players were not on the Stanley Cup roster, Dean did a great job at moving players around and bringing in guys who clicked with the roster. The Kings traded Wayne Simmons and Braden Shen to the Flyers for their captain Mike Richards in June of 2011. Dean then moved Jack Johnson, a player taken 3rd overall in 2005 by Carolina, who was traded to the Kings, to the Columbus Blue Jackets in exchange for Jeff Carter, who will play a huge part in the Kings winning the Cup because of his goal-scoring abilities. Now, more moves Dean made in his tenure include trading for Mr. Game 7 and Justin Williams in 2009, trading for Jarrett Stoll and Matt Green in 2009, and also drafting of Tyler Toffoli in the 2nd round in 2010, who will play a big part in the story later on. Now, we have to jump back to 2010, which was the first time the Kings made the playoffs since 2002. The 2010 Kings lost in the first round to the Canucks in 6 games. Anze Kopitar, Drew Doughty, and Dustin Brown were the 3 leaders, and Jonathan Quick was getting all of the starts for the Kings in net. The 2011 season, the Kings barely made the playoffs and lost in the first round to the Sharks in 6 games. The roster was starting to come around. Anze Kopitar was their star player, but they needed to make some more moves to get over that hump. And the 2012 season was a wacky one to say the least. And somehow, the 8th seed that made the playoffs in the West ended up winning the Cup. The Kings started out 13-12-4. Then they fired their coach Terry Murray, who had been there since 2008, and Kings assistant coach John Stevens would be named the interim coach. But on December 20th of 2011, the Kings hired Daryl Sutter to become the head coach, replacing John Stevens. Sutter was the coach in San Jose when Dean Lombardi was with the Sharks, and they were going to try to accomplish what they couldn't get done in San Jose. The Kings were 2 seeds out of a playoff spot with a month to go in the season. Their defense and Jonathan Quick were their 2 stars, and their goal scoring lacked consistency. The Kings ended the year with a 12-4-3 record in their final 19 games, and the offense was finally catching fire just in time for the playoffs. They made it as the last team in for the West. In the first round, they beat the number 1 seeded Canucks in 5 games. The second round, they faced the number 2 seeded Blues and swept them. Then in the Western Conference Finals, they faced the 3rd seeded Coyotes and won that series in 5 games. Finally, in the Stanley Cup Finals, they faced the New Jersey Devils and won the Stanley Cup in 6 games. The Kings became the first ever 8 seed to win the championship in North American pro sports history. They are also one of the few teams to win the championship while never having a home advantage. And the 2012 season was a make or break for the franchise. If they didn't make the playoffs or even win in the first round, they were going to fire Dean Lombardi. But his plan worked. Hiring his former coach and making moves for Jeff Carter and Mike Richards helped build a foundation that ultimately won them the cup. and Jonathan Quick took home all of the awards and was the best player for them in their cup run. The 2013 season was shortened, but that didn't stop the Kings from competing at the top of the NHL. They finished the year with the 5th seed in the playoffs and beat the Blues and Sharks before losing to the Blackhawks in the Western Conference Finals. Then we have the 2014 season, which was another one of the Stanley Cup seasons. The Kings entered the playoffs as the 3rd seed and faced off against rival San Jose. The Kings acquired goal scorer Marian Gaborik to help out back in March of 2014, and he was ready to go for the Kings. Losing their first 3 games versus the Sharks, the Kings somehow were able to win 4 straight games to win the series versus San Jose. Then in the second round, they faced their other rival in the Ducks and were able to come back from a 3-2 series to win that in 7. Then in the conference finals, they faced the reigning champion in the Blackhawks and won that series in a Game 7 overtime that got them to the Stanley Cup final. This Stanley Cup, they had to face the New York Rangers, and despite 3 of the games going into overtime, the Kings were able to win the Stanley Cup in 5 games, which included a Stanley Cup clinching goal in overtime by Alec Martinez in Game 5. But since that game, the Los Angeles Kings have not been the same. They've been consistently good, with playoff appearances coming in 2016 and 2018, but they also missed the playoffs in 2015 and 2017. The Kings fired Dean Lombardi and Daryl Sutter after the 2017 season, because the players just lost faith in Daryl and Dean wasn't able to retool the roster like he had done before. Another problem with the Kings has been their drafting, and that's one of the reasons Dean Lombardi lost his job. The Kings last year promoted assistant coach John Stevens to the full-time head coaching position, and they promoted assistant general manager Rob Blake to the full-time GM role. And even though I didn't think these were bad moves, I think the Kings messed up by promoting the guys from the previous regime and kept it in-house, because this roster really isn't improved and they need a facelift.
And now they just fired head coach John Stevens and replaced him with interim coach and former Canucks coach Willie Desjardins.
Like I keep mentioning, the Kings have lacked offensive success. Even though they acquired Ilya Kovalchuk in the offseason, they are at the bottom of the NHL in scoring. And for a team that can't score, this is going to get really ugly for them if they don't get it fixed. The Kings' downfall is just how sports work. You start at the bottom, build your way up, then have to sustain it or retool. And even though the Kings were competitive last year, Anze Kopitar is the only player who can keep their offense going. And that's not how you build a championship contender. Anze is amazing, is one of my favorites in the NHL. But the Kings might as well just keep losing and try to get a high draft pick to fix their scoring because they need help. And that's why the Los Angeles Kings are no longer what they once were. This video was chaotic to make. You can't pinpoint one thing that built the Kings 2 cups. They were built off years of struggling, finding some superstars along the way, and moving players to get different players who fit their culture. And obviously many more things. So I want to apologize if this video wasn't perfect, because it was hard to keep everything in order. Thanks for watching everyone, and tell me what you think. I think the Kings have the perfect opportunity to just aim low this year and get that high draft pick, and then bounce back next year. They have a good 3-headed monster with Kopitar, Doughty, and Quick. Now, they have to just rebuild everything else and become a much quicker team.